Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Diverse IQ, for all of your leadership on this important topic and reaching out for this expert panel today. This is something that obviously we've been talking about for some time, super important in the US. And, you know, we kind of decided, again, to maybe have me reflect a little bit about my move here to the US and how this issue sort of has been causing me to sort of self-reflect and try to help move the needle a little bit, right? So many of you may or may not know me. My name is Maria Latini. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Sustainable Investment Forum. I've only been here for about 6 months. I moved back to the US. I'm sure you can recognize my accent from the UK after spending 25 years there. Diversity had always seemed pretty core to my workplace and work overall, and I've seen the benefits of diversity in the workplace firsthand. Many of you might have come across me and from my previous work before. Specifically, I joined SIF. I spent 6.5 years building the FAIR initiative. Our founder there was Jeremy Collar. He was a PE secondaries pioneer, is very hugely successful, very ambitious. Our goals for FAIR were also very ambitious. And we had, I had to think about, as this first employee, how do I, take an issue like how we produce animals for food and put it center stage as a global megatrend and a huge financial risk to investors. And I knew in thinking through that gigantic lift at the time that I needed an innovative sort of startup entrepreneurial approach. And as the first employee, I need to start hiring a team. And I wasn't thinking about DEI per se, right? But when I thought about the challenge at hand of changing hearts and minds, of fund flows, an entire global industry, I knew I needed people on my team with a diversity of thought, a diversity of educational background, a diversity of culture, even diverse personalities. As I think some of us know, I have kind of a big one, and I needed there to be different levels of energies that everyone brought to the table. So new ideas, an energized team to get things done. And I mindfully thought out as I went through this process that I definitely needed a diverse candidate pool. And I thought that would be really integral to this process. I really was, attuned to not wanting any affinity bias coming from the financial industry. And in the UK at the time, I kind of felt like we really couldn't get enough of DEI, and we wanted to make our team stronger. And that was one avenue to consider and really try to embrace. And I knew that our staff felt empowered, and it translated into real material success. And then in May, I came back to the US, right? And I realized that diversity was slightly different. All these announcements came out about affirmative action, and I felt super naive and outside my comfort zone. And we were just talking about that before this started. I frankly still feel that way a bit. And I feel like I'm going through a bit of a DEI 101 moment where all of these differences in approach and thinking is coming to a head. And I realized in reflection that I really wasn't I hadn't noted enough all the differences in approaches from individual countries, or even something simple, and you guys will all know this from working in this field, right? Is that, the UK definition of sort of race, again, a naive Maria, was very much based on country of origin rather than color of skin. And then when I got to the US, I felt myself confused and a bit of fish out of water. So really, this is just to reinforce that this is both a global and a local issue. I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity. I'm trying to make my way and relearning things. So again, I want all of us to be able to be friendly and call each other out and learn as a community. And I truly mean that. So as global investors, I hope that our understanding of global approaches can help companies as well feel comfortable staying the course and communicating that the great work that perhaps they had already been doing internally should continue. And I worry that good business practice and culture around fairness and inclusion will be de-emphasized when it shouldn't be, as it firmly sits within financially material metrics and what investors need and request. So just before we kick off, as an anecdote, to sort of reinforce the fact that this is still front and center. When I joined in May, in June, we did an investor and market survey just after I arrived, just to ask the sort of the US community what issues were most important for their organization. And so, as you would imagine, climate and energy transition were at the top of the list. But just after those two, and water use and biodiversity, and again, this was for our network or those in receipt of our survey, actually was DEI. And that actually scored marginally higher than the category of human rights and human capital management. So it was super important then, and I think it should continue to top the list. So, and it's so ingrained in our definition of good company, right? So anyway, that's why I thought and was very encouraged by the conversation that Diverse IQ wanted to bring to the table and has been bringing to the table about, but particularly highlighting global perspectives. Investors, we know, have to stay on this course in order to find global relative investment opportunities, and so DEI progress and corporate culture are so important to be able to do that. So that's just sort of some of my reflections as I come back to this side of the pond, and I turn over to the experts now, and I look forward to hearing and obviously learning more. So thank you, Josh, and welcome, Reka and Kim.
Thank you. I'm Josh Raymer, the CEO of Diverse IQ, and we started Diverse IQ in early 2021 with the goal of taking a lot of the disparate information about human capital and diversity out there and helping stakeholders use it to make better decisions. So that could be investors that want to engage with companies and push them to get better in certain areas, and so being well armed with data, going into that engagement and saying, we believe you should be more transparent about your workforce, your peers are doing it, and here's why we think it's important for you, or integrating different factors into their decision making, either identifying opportunities or avoiding risks, or helping the companies themselves understand where they are compared to their peers and how they can get better at attracting and retaining great talent. And it's been amazing to see over just about 3 years how much more information is being reported by these companies, how much more they're doing internally to figure out what do our employees want, what do we need to do to get better at building a great workforce. And what's also amazing is it's almost all voluntary reporting in the US, whereas in a lot of other areas, especially Europe, it's mandated either by regulation or by different frameworks, but it's become the expectation because investors are demanding it and need it. The employees are asking for it, and it's also, everything's been kind of lumped together, ESG, DEI, but at the end of the day, almost every company will say something like, our workers, our people are our most important asset. It's very hard to measure that, but all of this is going towards, how does a company manage its people, its relationships with other stakeholders, other people, and the more information that's available, the better we can measure that, and then we can start to understand how that correlates or relates to their business performance. And also, we have to separate out the tying these things and figuring out what drives performance and also just what's the right thing to do. And I think there's two different groups and there's two different issues, and there's a lot of overlap, and it all gets lumped together. The headlines for the first 2 weeks of the year were pretty dire. DEI is dead, ESG is dead. But everybody we talk to, says pretty much the same thing, which is, yes, we're not talking about it as much. You'll see that it's not being mentioned as much on earnings calls, and executives aren't talking about it publicly as much, but internally they're still continuing to figure out what works and what doesn't, and how do we get better, and what do we need to do to build a great culture. And investors are not changing. As a matter of fact, they're asking for more from companies for the upcoming shareholder season in terms of being more transparent, setting targets, getting better over time, and the company and the Just Capital surveys several 100,000 Americans every year and asks them basically, what should a company be? What's important? What should a company focus on? And this year's survey will come out in a few weeks, but last year, 44% of the weight of a company's score was workers. And it's not, DEI was actually the lowest weighted. It was only 2.4% of the score. It's still important, but paying a fair and living wage was actually the most important, protecting worker health and safety, supporting workforce retention, advancement, and training, and providing benefits and work-life balance. And so those are all really important things to Americans and to the workers themselves, and that's what they believe a company should do. And that hasn't changed. And whether it gets rebranded, John Deere just changed their sustainability report to a business impact report, and I'm sure 10 years ago it was called something different. But at the end of the day, all this, more information is better. It helps all these stakeholders better understand a company. The companies themselves are better understanding where they are relative to peers. They could look to the leaders and the laggards, and they could figure out, how do we get there, or what are they doing well, and how can we copy them? And it's funny, not funny, but like you were saying, Maria, I was surprised because we talked to an investor that's been in this space for a long time on Friday, and they said they're having to go back and basically prove the business case for diversity, for human capital again, which I thought a couple of years ago was kind of proven. And she was asking for, can you give me a body of research so I can go to my investors and really say, here's why it matters. I don't think most people are waiting for more research to come out to say this matters. I think it's just been, it's been proven that all of this matters. And like Maria said, there's a lot of different ways to measure all of these things. And some things are financially material and you could really tie it to performance. Some things are just, again, people want a workplace that reflects more of society in terms of how it looks and different experiences and things like that. And it's become the expectation. So no matter what happens with politics or with laws, I think it's just kind of table stakes that companies are much more transparent. They disclose a lot more about what they feel is important to how they manage their people, where they are, and where they're going. With that, I'll turn it over to Rika or Kim, whoever wants to start.
Hey guys, I can go next. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Hey everyone, my name is Kim Strand. I'm a portfolio manager at Franklin Templeton, and I also lead our sustainable investing practice. I'm a part of our multi-asset solutions team. So we invest across many different asset classes, equities, fixed income, alternatives. So you can imagine there's just a lot of different ways that we look at sustainability factors, and DEI is one of them. Also very active on the firm's sort of operational DEI strategy. I work very closely with our Chief Diversity Officer, Regina Curry, who was appointed several years ago, along with our new CEO, Jenny Johnson, who really embraces this as an important, really a strategic measure and important factor for our global employee base. And I guess as a multi-asset investor, also a global investor.
Looks like Kim dropped off. Maybe, Rika, do you want to take the opportunity to introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. So my name is Rika. I'm with CalSTRS. I also I work on the Sustainable Investment Stewardship Strategies team at CalSTRS. So we focus our work on corporate engagement with our portfolio companies, as well as proxy voting, among a series of other things. We also invest in private markets, and we work with all the other asset classes within our organization on our net zero strategy. But today I was really interested to actually chat a little bit more about this concept of HCM, DE&I in globally, and how we think about it globally and how we think about it with our portfolio companies. So I think Josh mentioned, and Maria also, that there's just this changing political landscape. The language is changing very quickly in terms of HCM and DE&I, and what does that mean? And that's a question that we had, even within our organization when we saw the affirmative action ruling come out, we wondered, what are the impacts to us? What are the impacts to our portfolio companies? And, you know, would those companies that take federal funds be impacted, or would those that have more touch points in the political sphere be particularly impacted? And after many, many, many conversations with the companies that we hold in our portfolio, many of them, you know, they're staying the course. And at a few, it looks different outwardly, admittedly. They are changing some of the language that they use to describe the work that they do. But, you know, we've been advocating for a very long time for a greater understanding and implementation of best practice in D&I at all levels of the organization, because to us, that's what we think is a critical and value generating component. And companies that have meaningfully adopted these practices have seen more pipelines of talent into the organization. They've seen lots of benefits, and so the ones that we've spoken to it doesn't seem like they're rolling back what they're doing. Some are changing how they're communicating that, but I think they've also seen the benefits. And so you know, companies, I think, respond to the needs of investors, and I think there has been also a lot of communication from investors that might have changed, and but I don't think that investors are meaningfully changing in their expectations. And so several of our peers have stayed the course or even escalated expectations on D&I, and I think Kim is coming back on. But I just wanted to share that, you know, with when I look at a broad swath of market participants, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but within the broader marketplace, I've seen a lot of momentum forward. And when we even look globally, you know, one example is in Japan. I was on a call yesterday with some colleagues and some folks in Japan, and we were discussing Japanese corporate governance and issues that interest investors. And towards the end of the call, they were like, what do you want to see about human capital? We're hearing so much about human capital. Like, what is it that investors want? And it's definitely something that's top of mind for Japanese companies, particularly employee engagement in a place where the seniority system can be very entrenched, or high engagement is really important for those kind of companies. And so we're just seeing that in presentations more and more with Japanese companies. But I'll actually turn it back over to Kim, because I think that she was probably getting started. And
I'm sorry,
go
yeah,
right
my
ahead.
mic dropped, and then I thought, oh, I'm on the wrong one. How many years do we have to use Zoom before we get it right? Anyway, it was mid-sentence. Thank you for filling in. But I was just talking, and I think probably a similar theme as what was just being discussed, but it's a very regionally different situation everywhere you look, which I think again makes the data more important, but also the conversations around what the benefits are, what good looks like, what not so good looks like. It just becomes an even more laborious task to figure that out. Also, just understanding in different regions, even within the United States, there's differences in terms of what, you know, certain states are requiring companies to report out on and what other states are not. So I think that's a big thing. And, you know, I don't know if we ever get to the point where there's consistent disclosures. So that's one thing that we tackle, when we try to tackle sort of within region and even in different parts of the United States, is how do we apply a consistent framework using the data that we have, both quantitatively and importantly qualitatively. And I think everyone wants to try to figure out a solution, you know, with just like any traditional financial factor. How do we do that with this sort of stuff? But it just becomes much harder. But I think, like, you know, Josh, I think you said it in the beginning, and Maria, it's funny, I do feel like back to the basics, kind of showing the data again as to why DEI in particular, why there's a business case for it. I think we have to come back to that. And this discussion around sort of moral yeses and nos and financial sort of materiality, you almost have to separate it out, which is hard to do. But I do feel like we're coming back to that to show why this matters. And then it's also a very long-term benefit. It's not something that, you know, happens right away, or, you know, even you can institute a strategy right away. I think that's one thing we learn as investors as well, is we have certain things that we look at for companies, but we have to really look at it over a 2-year basis, not quarterly. So those are the two things I would just start to highlight, is the regional sort of patience required, and a thorough review qualitatively and quantitatively, and also just the long-term nature of this.
Rika or Kim, are you seeing any major differences now versus 12 months ago as you go into, or as you're doing your engagements, or as you look ahead to proxy season, or just, as you talk to different participants in the industry, or what changes have you seen?
Yeah, I can speak first to this. So I do think over the last, regardless of what's happened over the last year with some of the sort of more negative headlines, we are in a much better place to determine, to talk to corporates. I'll speak to the corporate side versus sovereigns, but to speak to companies, we have the data. It's still sort of not perfect, but we do come armed to conversations with companies from a much better place. What's happened in Europe with SFDR and the regulations around sustainable investing, I think has just equipped a global asset manager like ourselves with much more resourcing, tools, data, and analytics. We're reviewing lots of different things all the time. Companies like DiverseIQ coming up with new stuff. We've been doing this for probably the better part of 5 years now. So we do come to the conversation from a stronger place. And I think, driven by countries like Europe, and you're starting to see adoption in other areas like Asia Pacific. But there is, just this, even though it feels a little frustrating over the last 6 months to a year, there is a lot that we've come a long way. And I would say Europe is really driving that. And even though there's question marks in terms of how SFDR has been rolled out, it's still progress, I would say. Interested to hear what Rika has to say.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of the things that you've mentioned. Is one of the things that that's been really interesting in having conversations with companies is that even many of them have, as I mentioned earlier, kind of stayed the course and kept up with their commitments because they do see the value, but others have even firmed up their commitments to really make them unimpeachable because of the political atmosphere that we're in, or just the dialogue that we have going around. And I think on a regulatory front, as you mentioned, there's movement forward, in UK, Hong Kong, India. We're seeing that companies are reporting on how much they're spending on HR and protecting human rights, and it's different. It's very fragmented across the world, and I don't know how everything comes together, but I think that's also the nature of the different markets, is that there's always going to be a little bit of nuance between them.
What's your approach when you do have to push that message of here's why it matters? What does that look like today, which is hopefully a lot easier than it was 3 years ago, but it still seems like depending on who you're talking to, you have to push that message and say, here's why it matters, or here's, even if I think of some of what's going on today, where it could become criminal to actually use information in certain states, or basically there's certain politicians that want to say this information, because it's not financially material, that's their assumption, that it shouldn't even be allowed to be used in the process. And it does seem like the actual practitioners in those states are pushing back and saying, no, you can't hamstring us like that. But how do you approach that argument, or that that message of here's why it matters, and here's why we need more of this, and here's why even some of this should be required to be reported, so that at least we have consistent data and we have it from every company?
Yeah, I can start. I think I actually don't think, when I'll speak to my own company and our initiatives around DEI, I don't think we have to re-educate folks. I think at this point, it's more of a question of, okay, we understand this in theory and there's some pushback, so we really have to be, maybe a little bit more thoughtful around our approach. And really, it's understanding now the details about what we're trying to do and measuring what we're trying to do, and doing all of those things in a way that doesn't trying to think of the right words, but that makes the most sense from a business case again versus a moral right or wrong. And that takes time. Again, it's very regional. You know, we operate investment teams, HR, legal. It's a large company. And then you have to sort of work really leader by leader to get this approach correct. And then there's no one size fits all. And so what our chief diversity officer is doing is going business line by business line and talking to the leaders about what their approach is, where they're lacking around DEI, and what is it that ultimately we're going to try to measure. So it's a whole nother strategy in and of itself. But I think everybody understands that it is really synonymous with culture in a lot of ways and employee satisfaction. And we've been doing surveys on, you know, how employees are doing since the dawn of time. So this is just sort of an added piece of that we have been doing for a while, but our chief diversity officer is really bringing a more of a structure to it, which requires time and resources. And now she has people in each of our major regions to help our leaders roll out their plans. And we're still probably halfway through that sort of first phase. We've been reporting on data for a long time, but now here we're taking the next steps. We're setting targets over the next 5 years. So yeah, I think when we look at companies, it's sort of taking that same view, understanding what the goals are, what the objectives are, and how that's actually being implemented like any other business strategy.
I mean, I wonder, Kim, and you know, how, admittedly, because that's sort of a holistic view and taking kind of a tailored approach, but how much does what you're doing in other parts of the world, do you think, I mean, help sort of drive improvements in other areas? And I would say that even for your own organization, but then do we feel like other countries are, you know, wanting to get ahead, irrespective of what's happening of noise in the US and or regulations that may be coming out in other parts of the world? Because, you know, again, we hope the business case has been set, but there's just ambition to be better global companies. So does it have a little bit of that contagion effect, at least on the ground?
Absolutely, it does. It does for sure. I mean, you were across the pond before, right? Our UK colleagues and what's going on there relative to reporting and ambitious sort of targets and all that. We in the US understand fully what's happening there. And, you know, you would hope that the business case speaks for itself and some of these things speak for itself. So we just adopt that. But I think there's, it's not quite that easy, you know, at the end of the day, but there's absolutely synergy between that, for sure. And even, you know, I
would even say, you know, at my previous organizations, irrespective of what might be happening on sort of the more progressive HR policies or legal front, my team insisted on moving in this direction. And we're inspired by what they heard of other companies out there. Again, this idea of global competitiveness and resilience by having a strong culture and a strong sort of united workforce, if you will.
Right.
I just saw, you know, we talked about people not communicating this as much or being a little shyer about talking about it. I just saw there was an interview with Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan CEO, the world's largest bank. And he started off by saying, I'm a full-throated, red-blooded, patriotic, unwoke capitalist CEO. But he talked about how important all of this is, how important DEI is to JP Morgan, and how it is a journey. How, you know, they started doing a lot of stuff just to do it, and now they're much more thoughtful about why they're doing it and how it helps them, and they're much, you know, they've been doing this a lot longer, but there's a lot of other companies that are literally just starting to ask their employees, what do you think? How are we doing? Who are you? And gathering the data, at least in the US. But no, we've heard it's definitely a lot of companies think of this as a competitive advantage. We did a webinar, and we had somebody from BNY Mellon on talking about why they've been doing pay equity studies for a long time and disclosing their unadjusted pay equity numbers and how they think about pay equity. And they said it's a competitive advantage. We're going to be able to attract and retain, you know, people over our competitors because we're doing this, because we're transparent, we're going to talk about where we are and how we're going to try things and we're going to get better. And it's a process. And, we've heard that from a lot of people. Mark Cuban was just having a back and forth with Elon Musk, and he talked about how it is really a competitive advantage and something like it's crazy to not consider these things. We can't just make decisions based on race or based on, what group somebody is in, but to not even consider this information is you're going to not be able to compete with other companies.
Yeah, I think the companies that have really like internalized what the financial value of this is to them are the ones who are able to say that, this is just ensuring that the pipelines for sourcing talent are varied. This is just ensuring that employees feel valued and thus we can encourage retention. This is just ensuring that inclusion is a priority so we can leverage the benefits that come from those diverse viewpoints. And I think the companies that have really internalized this and really made this something that's a value driver for them are the ones that are also able to communicate that message really easily, because it's not something that's just being done at face value.
I mean, and maybe that brings in just one question that would be useful for me, or maybe it's merging into the same, but I mean, how do we start to distinguish DEI from human capital management and and has that changed the approach to the global strategy?
I was going to bring this up too. I think this is part of the issue, I think, with sustainability or ESG is that it tried to encompass all these different factors. And you hear, you started to get, well, oh, that's so ESG or that's not ESG, right? And it's like, there's so many different factors underneath that. And just like, traditional financial metrics, they don't all matter. Some of them do, some of them don't. So we try to really distill it down to the nuts and bolts, like each of these factors and test for materiality. But I think that DEI may suffer the same thing. And I know when you talk to first-time leaders or folks that are a little bit more cautious on this, the first question is, I mean, it's all a lot of the weight is on the D and really being careful around what can I ask my workforce around race in particular, even gender. And that conversation is scary for folks that have, I mean, this just requires a lot of education, but you kind of forget that there's all these other pieces to it too. And the equity piece is its own huge conversation, but the inclusion part, synonymous with culture, synonymous with valuing your employees. So perhaps there's just it just becomes too broad of a topic. Now, Maria, I forgot your question, but it was reminding me of that, like that thought. There's just so much there, and a big piece is kind of untouchable sometimes because of fear of litigation or whatever. So just becomes tougher, but disentangling all of that to its kind of more core would be helpful.
No, I think that touches on it. I don't know if you have a reflection on, again, and I think some of these terms, to your point about ESG, become interchanged, and hence being a bit more precise maybe is more appropriate or safer when we're trying to discuss some of these issues, and therefore that disentanglement seems to make sense to me, where I feel like, could cause some stumbling or some hushing around not wanting to discuss these issues more formally. Sorry, Reka, over to you for that.
No, I think I agree entirely in that, like, sometimes, DEI, it can be very politicized. And so disentangling it seems like a step forward, but then also they're so entwined in terms of what they're trying to, what you can accomplish that, how do you do that? And I think that's a really big challenge. And so, what's the difference between DE&I and HCM? Well, I think it's just that they connect, they're very intertwined, they can be one and the same in certain aspects. And I think it's just the language that we use around them that maybe can be adjusted with in certain contexts to really make people understand that.
Yeah, and what's been interesting for us is we've just started to look at international coverage in the last 6 months, and there's a lot more consistent structured data, and it is really there's enough there in some regions where you can really see, how much is this company spending on their people, on hiring them, on retaining them through salary and compensation and benefits and even training, and what is the pipeline look like? So how many people are applying to jobs and how many of those are being hired in different groups and how many of those are being retained? and promoted throughout the pipeline, and who are those people? And you could really kind of put a number on it, like return on human capital in different ways. And, that's broader, looking at how does this company manage its people and what are all the different practices and policies that go into that. And I think DEI is a part of that. And again, like you said, it's hard to kind of separate it, and there's a lot of overlap. But, I think DEI is more the policies and practices around how that company thinks about making sure that they have a diverse workforce, and that their policies are equitable and people are feeling included. And it's not even just the workers, right? It's all their other stakeholders. And so you can't really untangle it, and there's a lot of overlap, and the names might change, but again, at the end of the day, every company is trying to do this, right? And they are not going to, that's not going to change. And they're going to have more information that's going to help them hopefully get better at it. And it's not going to, I said this when we were talking about this yesterday, Maria, you've been looking at this a lot longer than I have. And it's going to be always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I don't think we're going to move backwards. I think, again, it's kind of table stakes that, being much more transparent is just table stakes. When I started looking at this, most companies in their 2019 annual report said we have 30,000 employees. Maybe they would say, half of them are in the US. Maybe we'd say this is how many are covered by collective bargaining. And now, most companies are at least disclosing the granular makeup of the demographics of their workforce, starting to talk about the pipeline of hires and promotion and turnover, and then really talking about what they think matters to their business and setting targets. Like you said, Kim, they're really starting to say, like, we think this is what matters, and this is how we're going to build a great workforce. This is what we're trying to do, and we have a target by 2030. We're going to do this, and really starting to measure it. And, I don't think they're doing it because they're checking boxes and because people are telling them to do it. I think they're doing it because they realize it's really important to them and their business and their stakeholders. And it's going to be, over time, a process of getting better and figuring out what works for them. And it's going to be different in every industry and in every region. But, this hasn't changed in 20 years. What's changed is there's much more information about it, and a lot of people are starting to talk about it and think about it.
Which I guess points to why you guys even exist, right?
Well,
genuinely, like, in and of itself.
Yeah, and it's like Kim said, it's really hard because there's not a structure. Nobody knows, how should we report this? What should we call it? Where should we report it? Nobody's, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of there's all this information out there, but there is this huge opportunity for companies like Kim that are able to, harness all this information and really try to understand, the biggest thing is, like, where are the opportunities? How do I find a company before it becomes a great company? Or where are the risks where, like, there might be a great company that's, starting to lose their edge, and for somebody that's using these factors, that could be, really big, or just for pushing companies to get better. And I think we're seeing that from, the largest asset managers in the world to, other organizations focused on this. And again, there might be a blip where there's a risk that they have to step back and try to do other things. So I guess, Rika, like, we talked about this yesterday, but what's been really successful, at least from my standpoint on the outside looking in, has been in the engagement process, going directly to companies and pushing them to change, either just talking to them in engagements or through shareholder proposals. And, or through coalitions where companies have gotten together, with trillions of dollars in assets and said, we want you to publish your EEO on, or we want you to, have more board diversity. So where do you see that going, and what are some other avenues that investors are taking to kind of push companies forward?
Well, from our perspective, we're largely a passive investor, and so a lot of the the effects that we can have on the financial value of our portfolio can happen through engagement or through exercising our ability to vote our proxies, which we do across 10,000 securities. I think that's where we see a lot of impact within our proxy votes. We have hard lines globally in terms of diversity, even though, and we want to see certain levels of gender diversity across the board. I think in the US, also ethnic and racial diversity. And so we definitely state our position within our proxy voting, and we are in the envious position of being a very large investor. And we are able to, I think, harness that to drive value for our portfolio. Other things, I mean, shareholder proposals, I think, as we discussed yesterday, we're seeing, you know, it's weird, like simultaneously more and fewer of them, because they've just changed in the sorts of proposals that are out there. And you know, I'm trying to think, in prior years we haven't filed very many, and we think it's really helpful when we see other investors doing that. But we're also like wondering, what are other avenues that we can escalate with companies? We do that through engagement. We see a lot of value in looking at particular directors and how they might be responsible for certain risks, and how we can use a vote no campaign or exempt solicitations or in other ways. So other ways of escalating, I think, has been really helpful for us in US markets. But you know, those are just some of the things that we're thinking about in how to kind of move the path of disclosure forward, because we think that with the data, as we've all mentioned, that's really where we're going to be able to assess what's going on in our portfolio better, and see where there's room for growth for our beneficiaries.
And maybe that kind of answers one of the questions that we had from the audience, Josh, related to sort of using company data to be. So someone asked, might you share how company data and culture of transparency around DEI effectively improves business risk management? So I guess some of it is enabling you to have like in-depth, comprehensive conversations and assess risks in the portfolio. But do we have any other thoughts about how company data and transparency actually improves risk management, other than more access and more transparency to data per se?
I mean, I think it's, for us particularly, it's just we're a universal owner. We own, so like we can't individually look at every single company within the portfolio and manage risk on a broad basis, just without the data being available to us, and for data providers to collate that for us and give us the tools that we need. It's a tool for us to assess the portfolio and then figure out where there are risks and how we can address them. So I think, you know, I feel like that's just another way of saying, you know, it's just having the company data, having the transparency.
And how
effective
do you think, and that's great for you guys to assess your own internal risks, how effective do you think is having more data about company peers and sharing that with companies in order to help drive them, I guess, which is part of an engagement process, but help drive them to better outcomes? I mean, I think understanding what your peers are doing in other markets also might be a pretty effective use of company data, and being more transparent also for the industry itself, right?
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think companies now have much better insight into their peers or into best-in-class companies. We've heard a lot. We talked to one company it's a fast-growing tech company, and they're a B2B company, and they aspire to be in the S&P 500. And they've said, you know, we look to the largest tech companies in the world that have been really successful at building these great cultures where people really want to work there, and they're on all these great to work for lists. And we've heard, it's funny because we've heard the same thing about companies that are not in the tech industry and have nothing to do with that. They said that's who we're looking at too, because they're obviously doing something really well, and there are things we can take from them. But I think, listen, if you have information about, if you're doing an engagement survey and you understand really well about what's important to your employees, and you have the data to see what does our pipeline look like, who's coming into our pipeline, how are they moving through the pipeline, are we losing, you know, where are we losing talent that we should be retaining, or, you know, how can we reduce our turnover so we're not spending so much on onboarding and training, or, you know, is there a risk in our supply chain where that we're not seeing, and if we had more information, we'd be able to identify that. So I think having more information and being able to understand that and use that in running your business internally is really a great way to identify opportunities and risks. And then I think as an investor, the more information you have, again, is just going to help you, spot those opportunities and risks. And, it's right now, because the information is so disparate and is so hard to understand, it's even, there's a bigger opportunity out there because it's not easy. And the people that can really wrangle that data and figure out how to tie it all together and how to, see like, the companies that everyone wants to work for, what are the attributes about those companies? How do we, untangle those and use those to look at other companies and either, spot those opportunities or work with those companies so that they understand that they should be changing their, being more transparent or changing their practices so that they can, be great like those other companies.
There's a lot of untangling and entwined and disentwining, I think.
Yeah, and I think
it's a tangled web.
it's a little bit frustrating when you see, there's a lot of, companies that fail, whether it's Silicon Valley Bank or companies that are struggling like Boeing. You'll see people say, well, it's because they focused so much on DEI and they like lost sight of, there's a lot of of that, which is frustrating, but it's similar when you think about all of ESG and you're looking at Boeing, and I don't think anybody knows what's going on at Boeing, but it's the same thing, right? How could you have used information to better identify that there was a risk or that there was something wrong and there was something changing in their culture before it happened? I think that's what all this information is about, right? The more information you have about how they're running their company, and whether it was they were using contractors that weren't using the same level of safety and oversight, or whether it was they were losing good people and over time they had attrition and they didn't have that that knowledge. It's just another example of information that you'd want to have. And thinking about governance and using corporate governance information, Elon Musk used to own, call it 25% of Tesla, and now he owns 12 or 13% because he used a lot of his shares to buy Twitter. And now he's basically saying publicly, like, if I don't have a bigger stake, I'm not that motivated to keep running Tesla. And so he's basically asking for another huge pay package. He got 50 something billion a few years ago. And, the board of Tesla is a lot of insiders who've been there a long time. And so, it's information you'd want to have. You'd want to understand, what does the corporate governance look like at Tesla? Maybe they need some refreshment of the board. Maybe he has too much power. And so it's just another example of, it would be crazy not to consider corporate governance data and say you're not even allowed to use it in your decision making and it's not material.
Hey, Josh, you had some good insights. Just kind of a broader question around, some of the human capital metrics the SEC is considering pushing forward, and what do you think? Where do you think that all goes? Is one question, and then second, do you think we need that in the U.S. in order to push all this forward, or will the data just get better? Companies through shareholder proposals, et cetera, like we're just moving in that direction so that it's not as big of a piece of the puzzle, that regulatory piece.
Where are we going? That's really hard to say. The SEC originally said they were going to propose new human capital rules. I think it was the end of 2022. They expected it to be ready. And then near the end of 2023, they actually came out with a proposed rule and they said they wanted to finalize it by October. Now they say April 2024. But from my understanding, what I'm hearing is that it's just not going to happen in an election year. Anything, whether it's the human capital rule or some of the other rules that they were planning on finalizing, just because the risk that it's going to get challenged and overturned. So we'll see what happens. I do believe that information like the breakdown of a workforce, full-time, part-time, hourly, salaried, permanent, temporary, is really important. Really important to understand what a company looks like and how different companies are managing that, and what might be good, right? Is it better? Costco talks about their competitive edge because they keep moving towards a more full-time and less part-time, and they pay their people really well and they promote from within, and other companies might have a completely different structure. So understanding that we're a retailer that's really using, young talent, young people that are just going to stay there a few years and they're not so focused on training and there's a lot of turnover. So that, and then also just the cost, right? In the US, some companies might report, an overall compensation expense, which includes a lot of information, but they're not required to, right? It's just like untangling the SG&A expense, whereas in Europe, at least they have to report a separate expense. So being able to understand what does it cost to maintain all your people, and then basically bringing on new people, and then like training and development. I think that is really important. That was one of the things. And then, some sort of turnover rate is, which again, it's not required here. It's much more prevalent in Europe, even though it's not required. So really understanding, what that benchmark looks like at a company over time and across companies, and even broken down into voluntary and involuntary. And really
Right, and by
understanding-
level,
Right,
potentially.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, it's hard to like, I don't want to say that it should all be mandated, because again, it's really different across sectors. At a certain point, it maybe becomes cost prohibitive for smaller companies and for companies or for companies that are doing business in 60 countries, and it's really having to, start gathering that. But I do believe overall a turnover rate and really a measure of attrition is important. And then the other one was, and they were a little vague about this, but demographic breakdown representation numbers. Again, it's kind of become table stakes in the US for companies to say worldwide our gender is this, at least that's the low-hanging fruit, and then usually by leadership levels. And then in the US, the EEO1 is becoming the standard of how companies report it. In the S&P 500, any day now, it's going to be 80% are now voluntarily disclosing it. Smaller companies, it's a smaller percentage, but that seems to be the best way to provide a consistent breakdown and for everyone to be able to compare it. And then, a lot of companies are also saying, that's not how we think about our workforce. That's not how we don't use that data. Here's the way we think about it. And they're providing a better look at how we think, So as an example, automakers like Ford doesn't think about it the way the government measures it, which has been used for 60 years in kind of the same way. They say, really, we're union and non-union. And then, in each of those areas, we have kind of management levels. So they actually do something really interesting, which is they take their EEO1 and they produce an exact replica of the form, but they use their own levels and show how they think of those things. So, I think the leaders in terms of best practices are really saying, like, listen, we want you to have as much information as we have to know how we think about managing our business and how how we're measuring it and the targets we're setting and what we think matters. They don't, I think a lot of this data companies used to say it's proprietary and like, we're not even going to report an overall turnover rate because our competitors can use that. We're not seeing much of that anymore, but it's kind of funny to see this, how far we've come. 3 years ago, a bunch of companies would say, we're not going to report any of this publicly because it's proprietary and our competitors can gain an edge. And it's amazing that investors weren't demanding some of this 5 years ago, right? When you think about something like just the breakdown of your workforce geographically. So I do think we will see the SEC demand more. Where that ends up, I don't know. How long it takes, I don't know. I think it's going to be a long time where most of this is voluntary, but I do think we're kind of getting to a place where it is more consistent in terms of what's expected.
Right.
What are our peers doing? What's best practice? And so it's great to see that, but it's also frustrating because when you see where Europe and some other regions are going, it's just becoming the norm, not the norm, it's becoming required, or at least everyone's reporting it in the same way, using the same language. Like management means 2 levels away from the CEO, whereas in the US, it's just everyone's kind of deciding we're going to report this management level, and then it's trying to figure out what that means across companies.
So I'm conscious of time, because we only have a couple minutes, but I guess maybe Kim and Reika, your reflections on whether we're hearing the same thing as Josh. I don't think we are putting all our eggs in the SEC human capital management basket, but in absence of that, I'm assuming it's, full steam ahead. You're continuing the good work that you both are doing. You're hoping that it seeps into other companies and better understanding globally. What is on your, just as a takeaway to the audience, what would you say your reflections on this year, and how can everybody else sort of stay the course, so to speak, as we go into 2024 and the potential more political noise around this issue in general and on this issue?
Yeah, I could go just quickly and turn it over to Reka. I do think that some of the backlash helps all of this get better over time. And I think in 10
Agreed.
years, we look back and we say, hey, this is a time where we really fine tune stuff. Companies like Diverse IQ come out and we make us better. We as investors, right? CalSTRS and Franklin Templeton work together. CalPERS is another big one. You know, we're coming together to figure out what makes the most sense and how to push the whole industry and the companies we invest in. So I do think that's kind of my high level take. And I like to hear it, like, show me the backlash, show me where we can get better, you know, all of that. Yeah. And I like Josh said, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have dreamed I'd have so much data, even in the US. So I think that's very optimistic for the future, no matter what the SEC does or the regulatory bodies.
I think just the floor for date, like the floor has, has moved upward. And so there's a huge desire for data information. We're getting more data and information, and that just begets more questions and more need for data and information. And that's just the direction that we're moving in. So I think it's been several years that this has been a priority, and it will continue to be. And there'll be more nuanced questions that we can ask and find out about.
Yeah, I think
Kinda
Kim,
wanna
you're right.
wrap it.
I think
With your
the
thoughts?
backlash is great because it pushes, like,
I mean, let's all, great. So,
no,
but I
no,
agree.
I
It
think
forces
the
us to be more precise. It means we have to mean what, we have to say what we mean. And we have to, check ourselves, which, okay. But
I think some of what's happening today is a little bit ridiculous, but I think the constructive conversations, the engagements where companies, with the back and forth, it really, you need to understand what works and what doesn't, or okay, we tried something, it wasn't the right thing. And I think big investors have really been the biggest ones that have gotten us here. And I continue to see it in like an organization called As You Sow files a bunch of shareholder proposals, and they've gotten 40 something companies, including Nike, to start reporting hiring, promotion, turnover rates broken down by gender and race in just the last couple of years. And so like they've kind of established the framework and said, this is how you should be reporting it. And that becomes the norm. So we are starting to like see companies coalesce around a certain way of reporting it and what's expected. But a lot of this is just, the companies say internally, this is how we measure our performance. And so that should be that should be what they're reporting out. So it's funny to see companies that say that, and they might even use it in their compensation measures. We're using this data to, that's driving some of our incentive comp, but then they don't actually make it public and give their stakeholders that information.
So look, I mean, I'll just say a couple of words and then again, but I appreciate, all the work that Diverse IQ has been doing on this topic and helping to educate, our members of USF and me personally. And I really appreciate, the leadership of Kim and Reka, and they're just welcoming, our outreach to speak. And hopefully we can continue the conversation. I mean, at USF, obviously, we want to make sure that S issues are elevated this year, particularly as I feel like they've somehow been quieted down by maybe no fault of anyone. Really appreciate everyone joining today. Any questions that we haven't addressed here in the questions, please send them through. You have an expert of experts here on this call, and we want to continue the conversation. So thank you. I appreciate Diverse IQ in leading this conversation, and really appreciate Reka and Kim for joining.
Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you,
Thanks
Maria.
for the opportunity to be here today.
And thank you everyone for
Continuing the
joining.
conversation. Thanks.
Bye.